The silence was the first violation. Before the weakness, before the cold that seeped into his bones and refused to leave, there was the silence. For Zenith Blackthorn, Alpha King of the United Northern Packs, silence was an alien concept. His entire existence had been a symphony of sensation, conducted by the magnificent beast that shared his soul. He heard the whisper of the wind through the pines at the farthest edge of his territory, smelled the coming rain on a breeze 3 valleys away, felt the thrumming heart of his pack as a constant living pulse beneath his skin. His wolf, a colossal silver beast named Lycos, was not just a part of him, he was him. They were 2 halves of a singular, dominant force, their thoughts and instincts an inextricable torrent of power. Zenith himself was a man of striking presence, with dark hair that fell in waves nearly black, a strong jawline that spoke of breeding and power, and eyes like molten gold when his wolf was close to the surface. His tall, powerfully built frame was the very picture of alpha dominance. Now there was nothing. A vast, hollow chamber where a god had once resided. The connection, once a roaring bonfire, was a single, cold ash. He reached for it, desperately, clawing at the emptiness in his own mind, but found only a void that echoed with his own frantic panic. The world, once vibrant and alive with the input of his heightened senses, was muted, flat. The scents of the forest were just smells, not stories. The sounds were just noises, not information. He was deaf, blind, and utterly, terrifyingly alone in his own body. It had happened during the scourge of the Red Fang rogues, a coordinated assault on the capital, more audacious than any had thought possible. Zenith had been at the forefront, of course, a whirlwind of silver fur and righteous fury. Lycos had reveled in the battle, a perfect engine of destruction defending his territory and his people. He had torn through a dozen of the snarling, maddened rogues, his claws and teeth a blur of righteous judgment. Then he'd faced their leader, a grotesque creature with mangy fur and eyes burning with a sickly green light. The rogue was larger than the others, unnaturally so, and wielded a jagged blade that shimmered with a faint, oily purple aura. Cursed metal. Zenith had known it instantly, the acrid smell of forbidden magic stinging his nostrils. He had been cautious, but the rogue was unnervingly fast. In a lunge that should have been impossible, the blade had slipped past his guard, scoring a deep, searing line along his spine. The pain was instantaneous and absolute, a fire of pure agony that made his wolf scream. But worse than the pain was the cold that followed, a creeping numbness that spread from the wound like a frozen tide, extinguishing the fire of his wolf's spirit. He had faltered, stumbled, and in that moment of weakness, his betas had swarmed in, finishing the rogue leader. But the damage was done. When he forced the shift back to his human form, collapsing on the blood-soaked earth, the silence was already there. He was just a man. The council of elders convened before his fever had even broken. They stood over his bed, their faces grim masks of political necessity. He could see the pity in some, the fear in others, and the cold, calculating ambition in the eyes of his cousin, Lord Valerius. The Alpha King cannot be without his wolf, Elder Thane had pronounced, his voice heavy with false regret. The bond is the source of his strength, his authority, his connection to the pack. Without it, he is incomplete. Incomplete, a eunuch of the soul. They spoke about him as if he were already a ghost. He tried to speak, to command them with the alpha authority that had always been his birthright, but the words came out as a ragged, human whisper. The power, the presence that could bring 1,000 wolves to their knees, was gone. There was no growl in his chest, no pressure in the air. Valerius stepped forward, his expression a perfect blend of sorrow and resolve. The kingdom needs a leader. The rogues are scattered but not defeated. We cannot show weakness. For the good of the pack, Zenith, you must step down. They didn't even look him in the eye as they stripped him of his titles, his lands, his very name. He was no longer Zenith Blackthorn, Alpha King. He was just Zenith, a wolfless pariah. The final decree was exile. He was to be sent to the Grey Wastes, the untamed borderlands that served as a buffer between their territory and the lawless wilds beyond. It was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. A wolfless man, weakened and sick, would not survive a week. His royal guard, men who had sworn blood oaths to him, bowed their heads and shuffled away. His intended mate, the beautiful and ambitious Serena, had looked at him with a horror that was worse than hatred, before turning her back and refusing to speak his name, even as he was dragged from the great hall. In the space of a day, he had lost his wolf, his crown, and everyone he had ever called his own. Merritt Holloway watched the proceedings from the shadows of the great hall, her hands clenched so tightly in the rough fabric of her omega tunic that her knuckles were white. She was a ghost here, a servant, someone to be ignored and overlooked. Her auburn brown hair was pulled back in a practical braid, framing a face with fair skin scattered with freckles across her nose, and hazel eyes that saw far too much. She was small and slight, her omega frame delicate in appearance, but deceptively strong, wiry, like a creature built for endurance rather than power. She was in her mid-20s, an age where most omegas had resigned themselves to quiet service. But her intelligent gaze betrayed a mind that was constantly working, analyzing, seeking answers in the spaces others ignored. Her hands, stained with the permanent marks of herbs and soil, were the hands of someone who had dedicated her life to healing. But her heart was breaking. She wasn't just watching the fall of a king, she was watching the betrayal of a good man. Years ago, during a smaller, less organized rogue incursion near the herb gardens, she had been cornered. A snarling beast, its eyes red with bloodlust, had lunged for her. She had squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the tear of its claws. But it never came. Instead, a wall of silver fur had slammed into the rogue, and the sound of a powerful, protective growl had filled the air. Alpha King Zenith, in his magnificent wolf form, had stood over her, shielding her with his own body. He dispatched the rogue with terrifying efficiency, then turned to her. His great wolf head had lowered, and his eyes, the color of molten gold, had met hers. There was no arrogance, no dismissal, just a quiet assessment, and then a soft chuff of concern before he had turned and loped away. It was a moment that had lasted no more than a minute, but it was seared into her memory. He, the most powerful wolf on the continent, had noticed her. He had protected her. No one else of high rank had ever so much as acknowledged her existence. Now, as she watched him being prepared for exile, wrapped in a rough commoner's cloak and worn boots, his powerful frame gaunt and hollowed by the sudden severing of his connection to his wolf, his face pale and drawn, she felt a fierce, protective anger rise within her. She was a healer. Her life was dedicated to mending, to nurturing, to coaxing life back from the brink. And as a healer, she knew things others did not. Her own wolf, a small, shy creature, with a gift unlike anything she had ever heard of in her studies, was unusually sensitive to the life forces of others. When she looked at Zenith, she did not feel the utter void the elders spoke of. She felt something else. A flicker. A tiny, deeply buried ember, banked and suffocated by a smothering poison. But there. His wolf was not dead. It was dormant, trapped in a cursed cage of pain and silence. And a deep, unshakable conviction settled in her soul. She could help him. The ancient herbal texts passed down through her family spoke of such curses, of poisons that mimicked death and blades forged to sever the connection between man and beast. The knowledge was there, hidden in the brittle pages of forgotten lore. The council saw a broken man. She saw a patient. While the courtiers and guards turned their backs, Merritt slipped away, not to mourn, but to prepare. She went to her small room, her hands moving with swift, certain purpose. She packed dried herbs, potent tinctures, sharp needles, and clean linen. She gathered her most precious books, their leather covers worn smooth with age. She took a sturdy knife, a water skin, and all the dried rations she could carry. She had spent days in the library studying the exile party's roots, learning the scents and patterns they would follow into the wastes. When the time came, she would not follow blindly. She would track him by the very scents the exile party left behind, and her wolf's unusual gift for sensing life forces would keep her on the path where others would become lost. She left behind the only life she had ever known without a second thought. They were sending him into the wilderness to die. She was going into the wilderness to bring him back to life. The gray wastes lived up to their name. It was a land of stark, skeletal trees that clawed at the sky like the bones of some forgotten, massive beast, their bark stripped by decades of punishing winds until they were nothing but pale, weathered wood. Sharp-edged rocks jutted from the earth without warning, forming treacherous fields of slate and stone that would shred a man's boots and tear at his feet with each stumbling step. The ground itself was stony and unyielding, covered in a thin layer of frozen moss that cracked like glass beneath every footfall, covered in patches of ice that never quite melted, even in what passed for warmth in this place. A persistent, chilling mist clung to the ground, never quite lifting, transforming the landscape into something otherworldly and hostile, making it impossible to see more than a few paces ahead. The air smelled of slate and distant decay, of stone that had never known warmth, with an underlying sulfurous note that suggested volcanic activity long ago. There were no animal sounds here, no bird calls or rustling of small creatures, no insects or any sign of life beyond the most desperate forms. Just the constant moan of wind through the skeletal trees, a sound that seemed to whisper of death and endings, of countless souls lost to the wastes. Sometimes the wind carried an almost human quality to its keening, as if the land itself was mourning the men it had claimed. Zenith stumbled through it, each step an agony. His body, once a perfectly honed instrument of power, was now a traitorous vessel of weakness. A persistent fever burned behind his eyes, leaving him dizzy and disoriented, and a deep, aching cold radiated from the scar on his back, spreading through his spine with the persistence of a curse. Every rustle in the undergrowth sent a spike of useless adrenaline through him. Without his wolf, he was just prey, his human senses unable to distinguish between real threats and the thousand false alarms the wind created. He stumbled across frost-covered ground for what felt like hours, or perhaps days, his sense of time deteriorating as hunger and exhaustion took their toll. He found a shallow cave, little more than an overhang of rock that offered minimal shelter, and collapsed inside, his body racked with shivers he couldn't control. The cave was damp and cold, the walls weeping moisture that smelled like death and soil and the grave. Despair was a thick, cloying poison in his throat. He had been a king. He had commanded armies. Now he would die of exposure, or be torn apart by the first scavenger to scent his weakness, his body left to rot in this forsaken place where no one would ever find him, where his name would be forgotten as if he had never existed at all. He closed his eyes, welcoming the encroaching darkness, hoping for the mercy of unconsciousness, then death. A sound pulled him back, the soft crunch of a boot on gravel. He tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for a sword that was no longer there. A figure emerged from the mist, small and cloaked. A rogue? He pushed himself up, trying to project an authority he no longer possessed. The figure pushed back her hood, and he stared in disbelief. It was the Omega herbalist, Merit. He vaguely remembered her from the gardens, a quiet, mousy thing who always smelled of mint and soil, though her scent was mixed now with the iron tang of determination and the earth smell of the wilderness. "What are you doing here?" he rasped, his voice raw. She knelt, placing a worn satchel on the ground. Her eyes, a warm, clear hazel that held flecks of green and gold, met his without fear. "I am a healer, Zenith. You are hurt. I'm here to help." The use of his name without a title was a stark reminder of his fall. A hot flush of shame and anger burned through him. "I don't need your help. I don't need anyone's pity. Go back to the capital before this place kills you." His words were meant to be a command, sharp and final, but they came out weak and breathless. She didn't even flinch. She simply began unpacking her bag, her movements calm and efficient. "With respect," she said softly, but with a spine of steel he'd never have suspected, "you are in no position to give orders. And I am not offering pity. I am offering a cure." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "A cure?" The elders, the most powerful seers in the pack, declared my wolf gone. Dead. What can a little Omega herbalist possibly do? She paused, holding up a small, corked vial. They are politicians. I am a healer. They see a political problem. I see a patient suffering from a complex magical poisoning. She looked at him, her gaze so direct, so certain, it momentarily silenced him. Your wolf isn't dead. He's sleeping, and I am going to wake him up. For the first time since the blade had struck him, a flicker of something other than despair sparked in the void of his chest. It was faint, fragile, and utterly illogical, but it was there. Hope. The first few weeks were a brutal education in survival. Merit proved to be as resourceful as she was determined. She knew which roots were edible, how to set snares that could catch a rabbit or a squirrel, and how to build a fire that gave off minimal smoke. She moved through the bleak landscape with a quiet confidence that baffled him. She was an Omega, supposedly the weakest of their kind. Yet here she was, keeping them both alive while he, the former Alpha King, could do little more than shiver and fight the fever that still clung to him. His pride was a raw, gaping wound. He tried to help, to gather firewood or haul water, but his body would betray him, his muscles weak and his head swimming with dizziness. More than once, he had to sit, gasping for breath, while she finished the task without a word of reproach. Her silence was more damning than any insult. He was a burden, a useless weight she had inexplicably chained herself to. His resentment festered, turning his words into weapons. "Why are you really here?" he snarled one evening, as she handed him a bowl of thin, bitter root stew. "Looking for a prize? Think if you save the fallen king, he'll raise you up from the dirt?" Merit didn't rise to the bait. She simply stirred her own stew, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders for once, catching the warmth of the flames. "Years ago you saved me from a rogue," she said, her voice even. "You didn't have to. I was no one. Just an Omega in the wrong place. But you did. You stood over me, and you protected me. That is the king I remember." She finally looked at him, and the clarity in her hazel eyes disarmed him. "That is the man I am here to help. Not for a reward, but because it's the right thing to do, because no one else would." The simple, honest truth of her words extinguished his anger, leaving only a hollow ache of shame. She wasn't here for what he had been. She was here for who she believed he still was. The first real test came a month into their exile. They had made a more permanent camp in a deeper, more defensible cave behind a curtain of icy waterfalls that thundered down the rock face, providing a constant, deafening white noise that made it nearly impossible for anyone to approach without being heard from great distance. Zenith was beginning to regain some physical strength, though the inner silence remained absolute. One evening, as dusk bled across the gray sky in shades of mournful purple and blue, a sound broke the stillness. A low, guttural snarl, followed by another. Rogues. 3 of them, their forms lean and starved, emerged from the trees, drawn by the scent of their fire. Zenith's blood ran cold. He scrambled for the heavy branch he'd been using as a walking stick, his heart hammering against his ribs in a useless, human panic. He was no match for 1, let alone 3. He was going to die. He was going to watch Merit die because of his weakness. "Get behind me," he ordered, his voice cracking. But Merit didn't move. Instead, she grabbed her satchel and a lit brand from the fire. Her face was pale but set with a grim resolve. "No, you stay back. You're the one they can't injure." Before he could argue, she moved. She didn't run, she didn't scream. She threw a small pouch from her satchel onto the ground in front of the advancing rogues. It burst in a cloud of fine, pale powder. The lead rogue sniffed at it, then let out a choked, agonized howl, clawing at its own face. It was powdered lunar nettle, a potent irritant to a wolf's sensitive nose. As 2 of the rogues reeled back, blinded and disoriented, the third, enraged, lunged for her. Zenith cried out, a helpless, strangled sound, but Merit was already in motion. She dodged the clumsy attack, brandishing the flaming torch. The rogue, wary of the fire, hesitated. In that split second, she darted forward, not at the wolf, but at a thick patch of dry, resinous vines clinging to the rock face beside it. She thrust the torch into the vines, which erupted in a whoosh of flame, creating a sudden wall of fire between them and the beast. The rogues, panicked by the unexpected resistance and the spreading fire, snarled in frustration and retreated back into the woods. Merritt stood panting, the torch held high, her small form silhouetted against the flames she had created. Her eyes blazed with intensity and pride and the fierce joy of survival. She had not fought them with brute strength, but with her knowledge, her wits. She had protected him. The Alpha King. The realization hit Zenith with the force of a physical blow. The shame was so profound it almost brought him to his knees, a physical weight that crushed him from the inside out. He who had once commanded armies, who had faced rogues without fear, had been ready to die. A useless gesture of defiance that would have accomplished nothing. She had been ready to live, and she had fought for them both with intelligence and courage that eclipsed anything he had attempted in his weakened state. She had faced 3 rogues and won. He couldn't even stand without support. Later that night, as she tended to a shallow scratch on his arm from a flailing branch, her touch gentle and professional, her small hands steady despite the adrenaline that must still be coursing through her veins, he couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. The shame burned in his chest like a living thing, eating away at what remained of his pride. "Thank you," he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, inadequate for what she had done, for what she continued to do. She paused, her fingers still on his arm, her touch warming the wound. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm, without judgment or pity. "We protect each other, Zenith," she said softly. "That's how a pack survives. Not with dominance or power, but with loyalty, with showing up, with fighting when it matters. That's what makes a pack strong." Pack. The word hung in the air between them, filled with a new and startling meaning. He thought of his old pack, the one he'd lost, the one that had abandoned him. He thought of this new pack of 2, of a woman who asked nothing from him but his willingness to be saved. Perhaps she understood something the Council of Elders never would. Merritt spent every spare moment she could, often late into the night by the light of a precious tallow candle, poring over her ancient books. The texts were written in an old dialect, the ink faded on the brittle pages. Zenith would watch her, her brow furrowed in concentration, her finger tracing the spidery script, her auburn hair falling loose around her shoulders as she bent over the yellowed pages. He saw the healer in her then, the scholar. She was more than just a gatherer of herbs. She was a keeper of forgotten knowledge. One night, she let out a small, sharp gasp. "I found it," she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. He moved closer, peering over her shoulder. The page showed a crude but detailed drawing of a wolf's spine, with jagged dark shapes embedded along the vertebrae. "The cursed blades of malice," she read, her finger trembling as it pointed to the text. "Forged with iron from a fallen star and quenched in the venom of a shadow creeper. The blades don't just cut flesh, they sever the spiritual connection. Shards of the metal break off in the wound, continuously emitting a poison that deadens the wolf's spirit, forcing it into a state of deep, unnatural dormancy. It mimics death." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and bright with discovery. "Zenith, the blade that struck you. It's shattered. There are fragments of it still inside you. That's why you haven't healed. That's why your wolf is silent. The poison is still being fed into your system." A cold dread washed over him, followed by the familiar surge of hopelessness. "So I'm being poisoned from the inside out. It doesn't matter, there's no way to get them out." "Yes, there is," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. She flipped a few more pages, her small fingers moving with purpose. "It's a delicate process. The shards are barbed. They have to be drawn out with a poultice of silverwood sap and moon petal, which neutralizes the magic of the metal. Then they must be extracted physically, one by one." She looked from the book to his back, her expression one of intense focus. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's damp air. "You want to cut into my spine? With what, your herb knife?" "I have fine silver needles for lancing and probing," she said, her tone becoming clinical, her healer's voice taking over. The poultice will loosen the shards and deaden the nerves around them. It will be painful, but it's the only way. He stared at her, at the absolute certainty in her face. For months he had been adrift in a sea of despair. She was offering him a lifeline, a dangerous, agonizing lifeline, but the only one he had. He thought of the silence, the cold, the crushing emptiness. He thought of the shame of his weakness, of her having to protect him. Anything was better than this living death. He turned his back to her, pulling the rough tunic over his head. The long, puckered scar along his spine was a pale, ugly line against his skin, marked by the lingering traces of the curse that had brought down a king. The skin around it was raw in places, scarred deeply where his body had begun to fight the poison, but ultimately failed. "Do it," he said, his voice quiet but firm, every muscle in his body braced for what was to come. Merritt spent the entire day preparing. She gathered every ingredient she would need, grinding herbs on a smooth stone, combining liquids with precise measurement, heating them over the fire until they released their potency. She tested the temperature on her own inner wrist to ensure it wouldn't burn him beyond healing. She laid out her needles in a careful arrangement, the finest silver ones she possessed, each one sharpened to a point thin enough to pierce the cursed shard without damaging the delicate nerves surrounding it. She washed her hands repeatedly, working her small fingers under her nails with a brush made of boar bristles, ensuring no contamination would introduce infection. When night fell, she said a quiet prayer to the old gods her mother had taught her to honor, asking for steadiness of hand and clarity of vision. The process was an ordeal of excruciating intimacy. The poultice she applied was cool at first, spreading across his scarred back like a balm of relief, and she felt him relax slightly into her touch. Then, gradually, it began to burn with a strange, tingling heat that made his breath hiss between his teeth. It was a sensation that went deeper than skin, a magical resonance that seemed to hum along his very bones, resonating through the cursed shards embedded in his spine, drawing them toward the surface the way a lodestone draws iron. For hours he lay on his stomach on a bed of furs while she worked, her presence a constant, focused warmth at his back. She worked with meticulous care, her small hands steady and sure as they massaged the poultice into the wounded flesh, working in slow, circular motions, feeling for the shape of the shards beneath the skin. The intimacy of it was overwhelming, a strange vulnerability unlike anything he had ever experienced. This woman, small and unassuming, had more power over him in this moment than all his armies ever had. She could have hurt him. She could have let him suffer. Instead, she touched him with such gentleness, such fierce tenderness, that he found tears running down his face without his permission. Then came the extraction. "I can see the first one," she whispered, her breath ghosting over his skin. "It's just below the surface, maybe a quarter-inch down. The poultice is working." He braced himself, knowing what was to come, clenching his teeth and fisting the furs beneath him. He felt the sharp, precise prick of the needle, followed by a deep, pulling agony as she worked to dislodge the shard. A guttural groan was torn from his throat, his muscles seized, his entire body rigid with pain, his back arching involuntarily. "Easy," she murmured. "Don't move or I'll hurt you worse." He forced himself to relax into the furs, breathing hard. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice tight with empathy. "Stay still, almost there." He felt a strange internal shift, a minute release of pressure, followed by the faint click of metal against her tools. "I have it," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of triumph and relief. She showed it to him, holding it up to the firelight so he could see. It was a tiny, jagged sliver of dark metal, no bigger than a grain of rice, but it pulsed with a faint, malevolent light, like a tiny piece of evil made manifest. To think something so small could fell an alpha king, to think something so small had caused such immense suffering. They could only manage one extraction every few days. The process left him drained and raw, and it took time for her to brew more of the potent poultice. In the days between, a new dynamic formed between them. The barriers of rank and resentment had been burned away by shared hardship and forced vulnerability. He was no longer the king, and she was no longer the Omega. They were Zenith and Merit, two souls bound together in a desolate wilderness. She would tend to his recovery, her touch no longer just clinical, but gentle, careful. She would bathe the inflammation around his back, her small but surprisingly strong fingers massaging the knotted muscles with a healer's understanding of pain and healing. He found himself talking to her, telling her about his wolf, Lycos, trying to describe the joy of the hunt, the feeling of running under a full moon with his muscles singing and the wind carrying 1,000 stories. He spoke of the weight of the crown, the loneliness of command, the burden of decisions that affected thousands. She listened, her hazel eyes full of a deep, quiet understanding he had never found in any of his advisors, or even in his intended mate Serena, who had never looked at him as a man, only as a title. With each shard she removed, he felt a subtle change. The deep, pervasive cold in his bones began to recede, replaced by a faint, returning warmth. The world seemed a little less gray, the scent of pine a little sharper, but the silence in his head remained, a void that had become almost companionable in its emptiness. During one particularly difficult extraction, the pain was immense. The shard was lodged deep, hooked around a nerve, and had been partially dissolved by the poison, making it difficult to grip and remove. As she worked, sweat beading on her brow, her small face contorted with effort, he cried out, his body arching in agony. In that moment, something instinctive happened within Merritt. Her own wolf, usually so timid and gentle, surged forward with a wave of desperate empathy. She pressed her free hand flat against his back, not as a healer, but as a wolf. She closed her eyes, shutting out the physical world, and reached. She didn't reach with her mind, but with her spirit, with the very essence of her wolf. She sent a silent call into the void inside him, a whisper of warmth and comfort, a plea. He is here. We are here. You are not alone. For a split second, Zenith felt it. Not a sound, not a thought, but a feeling. A faint, phantom pressure against the inside of his skull, like a ghost's touch. It was a bare flicker of a presence, there and gone in a heartbeat, but it was the first thing he had felt in that empty space since the attack. He gasped, his eyes flying open. "Did you?" he started, but didn't know how to finish. Merritt pulled back, her own eyes wide, a flush on her cheeks. She had felt it too, a faint answering echo from the abyss. "The bond," she breathed, a look of awe on her face. "My wolf. He can feel your wolf." From then on, the healing became a dual effort. While her hands worked on his body, her spirit worked on his soul. With each extraction, she would place her hand on his skin and send her wolf's quiet strength into him, a gentle, persistent knocking on a locked door. And with each call, the echo that came back grew infinitesimally stronger. Months bled into one another, marked only by the changing seasons and the growing pile of cursed metal shards she kept wrapped in a leather pouch. They had removed 17 of them. Zenith was a different man. His physical strength had returned fully, the fever was long gone, and the haunted, broken look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, watchful intensity. His eyes, once the flat brown of a woolless man, had begun to show flecks of gold again, a sign that Lycos was stirring at the edges of his consciousness. He now moved with a predator's grace that was entirely his own, no longer just a pale imitation of his wolf. His dark hair had grown longer during their exile, falling across his strong jawline in waves. His tall frame, once gaunt from illness, had regained its powerful build. He took over the hunting, his human senses, honed by necessity, now sharp and reliable. He could track prey by the faintest disturbance of moss and lichen, could read the wind like a map. He protected their territory, his presence alone enough to deter most scavengers. He and Merritt worked as a seamless team. They rarely needed to speak, communicating through a shared glance, a subtle gesture, a touch that had become both reassuring and charged with growing anticipation. An easy intimacy had settled between them, comfortable and profound. He found himself watching her constantly, memorizing the way she tucked a stray strand of her auburn hair behind her ear, the soft humming sound she made when she was grinding herbs, the fierce concentration in her hazel eyes when she was reading her ancient texts. His protective instincts, once a grand, sweeping force for his entire kingdom, had now narrowed to a single, razor-sharp point. Her. The thought of any harm coming to her sent a savage, unfamiliar rage through him. It wasn't an alpha's command, it was a man's devotion. One night, a blizzard descended on the wastes, trapping them in the cave for days. The wind howled outside with a fury that seemed almost alive, a mournful, lonely sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth, a wail of something ancient and suffering. Snow piled high at the entrance to their cave, insulating them in a cocoon of white and silence, until the mouth of the cave was sealed, and the only sound was the muffled roar of the wind outside and the occasional crack of ice forming on the rocks. They sat huddled together for warmth under a pile of furs, the fire casting dancing shadows on the rock walls that moved like living things in the flickering orange light. The warmth of the fire was meager against the cold that crept in from the stone walls, and so they drew closer, seeking each other's body heat. The silence between them was no longer awkward or resentful, but full and rich, weighted with meaning and unspoken longing, heavy with the weight of months of forced intimacy and growing affection. For the first time, the space between them felt less like a barrier and more like a bridge. He found his hand moving of its own accord, his fingers gently brushing a lock of her auburn hair from her cheek. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment, savoring the contact, her skin warming beneath his palm. "Merit," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the furs and through her entire body. She opened her eyes, and the warmth in them made his breath catch. He saw not an Omega, not a healer, but the strongest, most courageous woman he had ever known. His partner, his savior, the woman he would burn the world to protect. "There's one shard left," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The largest one. It's directly over your primary spiritual nexus. It's the linchpin, the final lock on the cage, the one that's keeping Lycos locked away the deepest." He knew. He could feel it, a final, cold knot at the very base of his skull, a weight that seemed to press down on his entire being, colder and more substantial than all the others. It was the lock on the cage that held his wolf captive, the one that had resisted all her efforts to weaken it. "When you take it out," he began, the hope he had suppressed for so long now a wild, surging thing in his chest, threatening to break free, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "I don't know what will happen," she admitted, her honesty a balm, even though the words should have terrified him. "The transformation will be violent. It might hurt more than anything you've ever experienced. Lycos will be disoriented, angry, desperate to surface. It could take days for you both to rebalance. But whatever it is, I'll be here. I won't leave." He looked at her, at the unwavering loyalty in her gaze, at the fierce devotion written in every line of her small body, and a feeling more powerful than any alpha command, more profound than any pack bond, overwhelmed him. It was a raw, possessive certainty that bloomed in his heart and soul, a primal, urgent need to claim her as his own. "Mine," he whispered, the word a declaration, a vow, a claim that resonated deeper than any title he had ever held. He hadn't meant to say it, the word pulled from somewhere deep in his chest where man and wolf were beginning to merge again. But it felt more true than his own name, more true than any authority he'd ever wielded. Her eyes widened, and a soft gasp escaped her lips. She didn't deny it. In the depths of her hazel eyes, he saw an acceptance that mirrored the certainty in his own soul, a reflection of her own need and desire and conviction. "Mine too," she whispered back, the words a mirror of his own, a claim of equal strength. She reached up and brought his forehead down to hers, breathing him in, her small hands gentle on his face as she drew him close. It was a gesture of intimacy and confirmation that transcended words, a promise written in closeness rather than speech. The final extraction was a ritual. Merit prepared for 2 days, brewing the strongest poultice yet, sharpening her finest needles until they gleamed like silver moonlight. She gathered every ingredient she had left, knowing this was the last and most crucial extraction. The air in the cave was thick with tension and a fragile, burgeoning hope. Zenith lay on the furs, his back bare, his body taut as a bowstring, every muscle coiled with anticipation and dread. He could feel the last shard, a point of icy malevolence that was the source of all his misery, the final barrier between him and his wolf. Merit knelt beside him, her hands gentle as she applied the poultice. The burning sensation was immediate, intense, a fire that seemed to spread through every nerve, far more potent than any of the previous applications. As she worked, she placed her palm flat on his lower back, and he felt the familiar, comforting call of her wolf, stronger than ever before. "We are here. Come home." He closed his eyes, focusing on that call, using it as an anchor in the rising sea of pain. "I am ready," he grunted through clenched teeth. "Now, Merritt." He felt the prick of the needle, sharper this time, followed by a blinding, white-hot agony that eclipsed everything else. It was not a pull, but a wrenching, tearing sensation, as if a part of his very soul was being ripped out. He roared, a sound of pure, animalistic pain, his fingers digging into the furs, his entire body convulsing. He felt Merritt's entire body tense, her own breath held in a silent scream of effort. And then it happened. A cataclysmic shift. The pain vanished, replaced by a sudden, deafening roar in the silent chamber of his mind. It was a sound of pure, untamed power, of joyous, furious release. "Zenith!" The voice of his wolf, Lycos, slammed into his consciousness not as a whisper, but as a tidal wave. The void was gone, filled instantly with the brilliant, blazing presence of his other half. Power, raw and volcanic, surged through his veins. The cold was incinerated by a wave of glorious heat. His senses exploded. He could smell the ozone in the air from the coming storm, hear the frantic beat of Merritt's heart, feel the hum of the earth beneath him. A guttural cry was torn from his throat as his body began to contort. The change was not gentle. It was a violent, exultant reclaiming of his true form. He heard the sickening, wonderful crack and pop of his bones lengthening and reforming. His skin split, giving way to a tide of thick, silver fur. His muscles bunched and expanded, his human form shredding away like a useless husk. The pain was excruciating, but it was a pain of rebirth, of homecoming. When the transformation was complete, a wolf stood where the man had been, but he was not just a wolf. He was colossal, his silver fur shimmering like moonlight on water, his shoulders standing as high as Merritt's chest. His eyes, once a flat human brown, now blazed with the molten gold of a true alpha. Lycos was free, and he was magnificent. The great wolf turned his head, his golden eyes fixing on Merritt. She hadn't moved. She knelt on the furs, her face pale, her eyes wide with awe and not a trace of fear. In her hand, she held the final shard, a twisted, thumb-sized piece of cursed metal, now dull and lifeless. The great wolf took a step toward her, his movements fluid and powerful. He lowered his massive head until his nose was level with her face. He could smell her scent, a dizzying mix of herbs, earth, and a unique, intoxicating fragrance that was hers alone. Mate, the word resonated in his mind, a declaration from both man and wolf, a singular, undeniable truth. He saw it all in a flash of perfect clarity. Her loyalty, her strength, her unwavering faith. She had not just healed his body, she had saved his soul. The great silver wolf pressed his forehead against hers, lowering his massive head in a gesture of profound reverence and connection. His forehead touched hers gently, a moment of pure spiritual recognition. The gesture was intimate and tender, the first instinctive response of his wolf, not to display power, but to acknowledge his mate. Then, and only then, did he throw his head back and howled, a sound that shook the very foundations of the cave. But it was not a cry of dominance or triumph. It was a howl of gratitude, of reunion, of a wolf finally coming home to his mate. The sound echoed across the gray wastes, a promise and a proclamation. He nuzzled his great muzzle against her cheek, a gesture of profound tenderness and gratitude. A soft, rumbling purr, a sound he had not made in an eternity, vibrated in his chest. Merritt raised a trembling hand and laid it on his head, her fingers sinking into his thick fur. A tear traced a path down her cheek, a tear of joy and relief. "Welcome back," she whispered. News of a powerful Alpha's presence in the gray wastes traveled faster than a winter wind. Rogues who had held territory for years suddenly fled, abandoning caves and hunting grounds, sensing a shift in the balance of power that transcended physical challenge. It was as if the land itself recognized its new king. The rogues that had plagued the region vanished overnight, and within weeks there were no more reports of attacks on travelers or smaller packs. The land itself seemed to respond, the oppressive gray mist receding at the edges of their territory, allowing sunlight to touch the ground for the first time in years. The frozen moss began to thaw. Small animals returned, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Small groups of outcasts and lone wolves, drawn by the raw magnetic pull of Zenith's reborn power, began to appear at the edges of their territory. Many of them were scarred and broken, wolves who had failed in their old packs or who had never belonged anywhere. They came seeking something, though they couldn't quite name it. When they saw Zenith, strong and commanding, but not cruel, when they saw Merit moving among them with herbs and healing and genuine concern, they understood what they'd been seeking. They offered their allegiance, not with the formal rituals of old packs, but with a quiet decision to stay, to build, to be part of something new. A pack began to form, not from bloodlines and politics, but from shared hardship and mutual respect. The old hierarchies meant nothing here. A former Omega who had once hidden from her own shadow became Beta because she was quick and clever. A rogue who had killed 3 of Zenith's wolves in the first weeks of the pack's formation was welcomed and given tasks because Zenith saw potential rather than past transgression. Zenith and Merit's cave became the heart of a new community, not a throne room, but a home. He was their alpha, not by birthright, but by proven strength and wisdom. He made decisions that were fair and thoughtful, that considered the needs of the weakest members as well as the strongest. And Merit, without any formal declaration, was their Luna. She was the healer, the advisor, the steady, compassionate heart of their fledgling pack. She taught them which plants could heal and which could harm, how to preserve food for the harsh winters, how to live with the land instead of just surviving on it. She delivered pups when they came, sitting with laboring mothers and coaching them through the pain with experienced calm. She mixed poultices and tinctures, her small hands always busy. The wolves looked at her with a reverence they had never given any highborn she-wolf, because she had earned it through consistent, selfless action. They saw what Zenith saw, their salvation. She walked among them with her auburn hair usually pulled back practically in a braid, her freckled face alight with purpose, her small but wiry frame carrying an authority that no one thought to question. Even the largest males deferred to her, not because she was stronger, but because her wisdom had saved them. The rogues sensed her authority and respected it instinctively. They understood on some primal level that she was protected by something greater than her physical form. Her name became whispered with reverence throughout the camps, whispered by those who had been healed by her, saved by her, given a chance at a new life because of her. It was inevitable that word would reach the capital. One afternoon, as Zenith and Merit were overseeing the construction of a new smokehouse, a scent on the wind made Zenith's head snap up. It was familiar. Pack. His old pack. He growled low in his chest, a sound that made the wolves around him instantly alert and defensive. A delegation of 5 wolves emerged from the trees. At their head was Fenris, his former Beta, and flanking him were 2 of the elders who had condemned him, including Thane. Valerius was not with them, a fact that Zenith noted with a grim satisfaction. Word had reached them that Valerius, seeing the reports of scouts who had ventured to the edges of the wastes, only to be turned back by fear and common sense, had assumed that the cursed land itself had done Zenith's dying for him. Valerius had never dared venture into the deep wastes himself to confirm it. They stopped a respectful distance away, their expressions a mixture of awe, fear, and desperation. They were looking at him as if he were a god returned to earth. But his gaze, and the gaze of his new pack, was hard and unwelcoming. "Zenith," Fenris began, his voice strained. "Alpha King, I am not your king," Zenith cut him off, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of alpha power. The air grew heavy, pressing down on the delegation, forcing them into a posture of submission. You made that clear when you cast me out to die. Elder Thane stepped forward, his face a mask of contrition. We were wrong, my lord. We were fools. The pack is in chaos. Valerius's rule has been a disaster. He is a tyrant, driven by greed. The people are suffering. The territories are shrinking. We need you. Your pack needs you. Zenith let out a short, humorless laugh. My pack? He swept a hand out, indicating the rugged, loyal wolves standing with him. He looked at Merritt, who stood beside him, her expression serene and unyielding. Her hand rested on his arm, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. My pack is here. This is my pack. These are the wolves who valued loyalty over position. These are the people who saw a man, not just a title. He stepped forward, his golden eyes blazing as he pinned Fenris with his stare. Where were you, Fenris, when they stripped me of my honor? You, who swore a blood oath to me. Where were all of you? Fenris flinched, unable to meet his gaze. We were afraid, he mumbled. We thought you were lost to us. I was, Zenith said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I would have been, if not for her. He turned and drew Merritt to his side, his arm wrapping around her waist in a possessive, public claim. He looked directly at the elders, at the men who had dismissed her as a worthless Omega. This is Merritt Holloway. Your king was broken, and you abandoned him. This Omega, this healer, this woman of courage and conviction rebuilt him. She fought for me. She bled for me. She brought my wolf back from the abyss when you were all hiding behind your council chairs. She tracked me through the wastes with nothing but her wits and her wolf's unusual gift for sensing life forces. She extracted 17 cursed shards from my spine with her own hands, her own needles, her own knowledge, and her own sacrifice. She risked everything for a broken man who had nothing to offer her but shame and the possibility of death in an forsaken wasteland. He held her gaze, his voice softening for her alone. She is my mate, my Luna, my other half. Her place is at my side, and my place is at hers. She is your Luna too, whether you kneel to her or not. She chose this pack when it was nothing. She chooses it still. He turned his attention back to the stunned delegation. Their eyes were wide, darting between the magnificent, powerful Alpha and the small, unassuming woman he held as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. Go back to your crumbling capital, Zenith commanded, his voice ringing with finality. Tell Valerius that a new pack is rising in the Grey Wastes. A pack built on loyalty, not on titles. A pack led by an Alpha who knows the true meaning of strength. Tell them that the old ways are dying and a new way is being born. He paused, letting his words sink in. And tell them that Zenith Blackthorn has found his throne. It is not made of gold and stone. It is made of the unshakable loyalty of the woman who chose to stand with him when he had nothing. It is made of the trust of those who would follow him not because they must, but because they choose to. Without another word, he turned his back on them, a dismissal more absolute than any execution. He led Merritt back toward their home, his new pack falling into step behind them, a silent, unified force. He had lost a kingdom, but he had gained a world. Merritt walked beside him, and when she glanced up at him, her hazel eyes shining with pride and love and something deeper, he knew that every moment of pain, every moment of darkness, every moment of despair had been worth it. That night, the two of them returned to their cave. They sat by the fire, not touching yet, the tension between them thick and anticipatory. He was still learning the duality of his nature, the way he could be both man and wolf. And tonight, he wanted to be neither fully one nor the other. He wanted to be with her as both, as the complete being he now was. As the flames burned lower, he shifted back to his human form, his dark hair damp and clinging to his face, his golden eyes still bright with the lingering traces of his wolf. He sat beside her, close enough to feel her warmth. Without speaking, she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he reached down, drawing her against him as she turned sideways to face him. His hand moved gently through her auburn hair, and in that quiet moment, with nothing but the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional pop of a log. They simply held each other. Hours passed. The fire burned lower and lower until it was nothing but embers, and Merritt drifted off to sleep. Her head rested in his lap, her breathing slow and peaceful, her small body finally relaxed after months of tension and focused effort. One of his hands remained in her hair, his fingers moving in slow, soothing circles against her scalp. The other rested on her shoulder. He watched her sleep, this woman who had saved him, who had seen him at his most broken, and loved him still. For the first time since the cursed blade had struck him, Zenith felt peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose. The presence of someone to fight for, someone to return to, someone to build a life with. Inside him, Lyko settled into sleep as well, no longer raging or pounding against his chains, but content. At peace. Home. She murmured something in her sleep, something that might have been his name, and he leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Rest now, my king," she whispered, her eyes not quite opening, her words drifting from the edge of dreams. He smiled, understanding the double meaning. She had given him back his crown, but it was not the crown he had lost. It was something far greater, something built on love and loyalty, and the kind of strength that could only be earned in the darkness and brought into the light. He had found his true throne, and it was here, in this cave in the gray wastes, with his mate at his side and peace in his heart.